This is not turning out so well. And if they've actually done something which makes it more likely that a business is going to go down the self-employed route, there are things there which Labour will not be happy with.
What do you make of Reeves' "there is no alternative"?
I don't think it's a clever thing to say. It sounds lofty and arrogant. If you're going to flesh out this idea of what the long-term goal is, you have to be a good storyteller. And this government's hopeless at storytelling.
Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Dorian Linsky. On today's show, Rachel Reeves is refusing to back down over the budget, which apparently means she's the new Margaret Thatcher. How long does she have to show the public that it's working? And a new documentary about Loaded magazine has people reflecting on the legacy of 90s lad culture. Did it really pave the way for today's men's rights nightmare? Let's meet today's panel. First, author of The Future of Trust and creator of Jam Tomorrow, Ros Taylor. Hi, Ros.
Hello, Dorian.
Next up, columnist and author Marie Leconte. Hi, Marie.
Hello.
Finally, our guest this week is John Harris, Guardian columnist, host of Politics Weekly UK and presenter of the excellent Anywhere But Westminster series. Thanks for coming, John.
Thank you for having me.
Then we normally go to farmers' markets, but not farmers' marches. But you covered the demo for Politics Weekly UK, and you've long been tracking different kinds of sort of political unrest around the country. How organic was this version?
Well, it's fairly organic, in as much as there were lots and lots of people there who had probably never been on a political demonstration in their lives. The whole thing's quite weird because it was on Tuesday morning, don't forget. I've never been to a march on Tuesday morning before. And although there were people around who you could sense were sort of opportunistic, and some of them were quite high profile, Farage, Jeremy Clarkson to some degree, and I saw a sort of scattering of what appeared to be sort of fascist-y kind of people, not very many of them, but enough that you'd notice, people who looked like football hooligans, really, and had probably never seen a combine harvester in their lives, I wouldn't imagine. But setting all that aside, what I thought was really interesting was the sort of choreography of it, the symbolism of it, in as much as the protest congregated directly opposite Downing Street on the other side of Whitehall from the gates, right? So there's about 10 or 15,000 people there. And all the people on the podium and the people I was speaking to, they were all talking a very sort of emotional, quite stirring language about family and history and the land and death and bereavement and all this. And all you could hear from the government, if you looked on your phone or watched TV, was 20% of this and 60% of that, and 3/4 of farms aren't eligible, and you have 10 years to pay it off, And I just went straight back into this constant thing, which you probably saw in America as well, I dare say, Marie, is this thing that people have been writing about for ages, but no politicians ever take it on board, which is that the downfall of the centre-left, or the left more generally very often, is precisely that. It just talks in dry numbers. It thinks it's in a high school debating contest. And meanwhile, these other people are on this much more sort of human, emotional terrain, which it so happens people like Farage and Trump sort of embody. So it's a really sort of rich experience. And I feel sorry for a lot of the people I spoke to. I think there is an issue about billionaires buying farmland, but equally there's an issue about family farms. They're really worried about the future because they feel they're going to get whacked with this tax, rightly or wrongly.
So have you joined them? Have you becoming a landowner now?
Yeah, I bought a farm, Dorian. I'm going to grow parsnips, and I've got 3 cows.
Harris's farm.
Yeah,
coming soon.
Literally anywhere but Westminster. That's the idea. Anywhere but Warminster, it's called. That's the town in Wiltshire for non-metropolitan listeners.
Let's begin. Rachel Reeves has defended her budget to the CBI with the Thatcherite phrase, "we had no alternative." The New Statesman says she's channeling Thatcher, who stuck to her monetarist revolution in her first term in the face of enormous resistance, riots in British cities, opposition from most economists, lowest approval rating in British history, cabinet dissent and all that. Even chief monetarist Milton Friedman thought she'd blown it. But she stayed the course. Will a Labour Chancellor be given the same opportunities? Ros, apart from the aforementioned farmers, the loudest critics of the budget have been businesses and the wealthy. Does that mean it's working politically? Do you think she'll be happy with the kind of blowback?
Yeah, I think generally she's not unhappy with that. But as so often with budgets, the real consequences of what you've done kind of start to trickle out in the 2 or 3 days afterwards, and then in a couple of weeks later you've got a much better sense of who they're going to hit, and the people who are most affected have started to make the noise. And of course in this case this is businesses, and because Labour had as far as they were concerned, they had to keep to their red line on not taxing working people. They had to do this shimmy thing where they taxed employers instead. Now, the overall result is often the same, in terms of the impact on the economy, because there are fewer jobs. As a result, businesses don't hire as much, and they don't award the pay rises that they were going to give. But of course, you can't really quantify that. But it's a lot of money we're talking about. For the average employee on 33 grand a year, it's 900 quid extra employer insurance contributions, which is quite a lot for particularly a small business to find. And it's not just business, of course. It's also things like charities and GP surgeries and so on. So this is not turning out so well. And of course, Rachel Reeves got a hard time at the CBI on Monday when the businesses told her how difficult this was going to be. There's also, there were a couple of bad points about it as well. I mean, disincentivises part-time work as well, because the threshold for employer contributions is lower. So that's not great for women who are trying to fit work around their caring responsibilities. It makes self-employment more attractive, contracts more attractive, which is not what Labour wants to do at all. Labour wants to regulate work more and, improve working conditions. But they've actually done something which makes it more likely that a business is going to go down the self-employed route. So there are things there which Labour will not be happy with.
Well, we'll get more into the detail, but overall, Reeves and the government generally doing enough to sell the reasons why some taxes have gone up, like stabilising the NHS, like what you are paying for.
Oh yeah, undoubtedly. I think that is the big. There's no one can deny that. Public services generally need more money, and the NHS and the waiting list is clear, and they have made that case. And it is clear that they need to get the money from somewhere. And of course, their argument is this is the best we can do given the constraints that we've put on ourselves. I think it's opened up a wider question about funding for other things rather than just the NHS. I mean, I think people, and I'm sure John will be talking about this soon, are starting to say, well, what are we going to do about councils? Because that's
of course. Yeah.
And that's not something which Rachel Reeves has tackled in this budget meaningfully.
She gave him a bit of money. 1.3 billion, but the local services black hole is significantly bigger than that.
Yeah,
it's a nice little treat, isn't it? 1.3 billion is
it's sort of survival.
Oh, yes, that's a bar of chocolate.
It's survival money, and it keeps them breathing for another year. But that's not the nature of the crisis that they're in.
Well, there's black holes everywhere.
There are,
and crises everywhere. And polling on the budget is quite confusing. 2/3 of voters in a Daily Mirror poll agreed, in theory, that taxes should rise to repair public services. What do you make of Reeves' "there is no alternative" line?
I don't think it's
right?
a clever thing to say. I think if you've got Margaret Thatcher's chops and authority, and if the public buy into the idea that you're the person or the woman to sort it out, which enough of them did when she was using the phrase, then it might be a winner. But I don't think Rachel Reeves is the kind of politician who can carry that off. It sounds lofty and arrogant. And I think people feel that about this government anyway, because it's like that way. It's like that in its general disposition. It's very cold and bureaucratic, and whenever most of its leading lights appear on TV, they look nervous, right? It's a very, very bad combination. I just don't think Reeves has got the authority or the heft, and that's a shame. I sort of feel sorry for it to some extent. The problem is, you see, I think the essential condition of the country, if you talk to most people, I think I feel this myself really, is that obviously what Ros said is absolutely right, and it's good that money's going into the public services, or some of them anyway, and in the fullness of time, when people maybe start to see evidence of that, the conversation might change. But right now, people feel in every area of their lives that they're paying more to get less, right? I think that's the sort of defining aspect of the national condition. And it takes a politician of great skill, really, to get over that and say, well, I know that's the case, but, all these lines Starmer always comes out with about this is the difficult part and it's going to get worse before it gets better. But it rings hollow. And the other thing, I think, in the political mood at the moment, which has become a cliche now, this whole anti-incumbency thing. But I think voters are impatient. I think social media has done that, actually. I don't think the idea of a 5-year political cycle makes any sense to most people. And so most people, not unreasonably, because they've been suffering for 13 or 14 years, are like, fix it now.
Well, I mean, a justified criticism of politics has been generally that it is too short-termist.
Yeah.
And what they do is they are pitching Starmer and Reeves a sort of a long-termist strategy and just going, we're making the right decisions now. These things take time. But does that work with an increasingly short-termist election?
No, and you've also, if you're going to flesh out this idea of what the long-term goal is and why people should have to endure pain in the here and now, you have to be a good storyteller. And this government's hopeless at storytelling.
Isn't the problem as well that you need to rely on people's faith for that? Like, if you want to go, like, actually, like, bear with us, we'll make things better, but it's going to take time. You really need an electorate that's willing to actually look at the political class and go, fine, we will give you a chance. And the problem is, I suspect that after 14 years of, we have a plan. No, hang on. Now we have no. This time we have a plan. Now, I worry that faith is just not there at the moment.
Well, the Thatcher example is interesting because people sort of really weren't willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. She was enormously unpopular and had Argentina not invaded the Falklands, who knows what would have happened there. But
I don't believe that theory, Dorian.
Do you not?
No, I don't. I
think
think given the state the Labour Party was in at that point, and so on, it would still have worked.
But she was certainly vastly unpopular, like 2 years in, and people were not going like, I know it hurts, but we sort of trust you. I mean, there's an alternative, obviously, as an echo. But Marie, do you think that the sort of the Iron Chancellor stuff and all that is it just because she's a woman?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. No, obviously. But in the same way that I think when Theresa May was kind of doing, like the early days of Theresa May when it was still going well, she was high up in the polls and, going against Brussels with her red, white and blue Brexit, etc. All the papers, all the right-wing papers were essentially pitching her as the new Maggie and the new Iron Lady, etc. So, I think it is just like slightly boringly just 100% gendered. I think they probably would have tried it with Liz Truss if they'd had the time, but sadly.
But is it weird almost that this idea that just to go, I am sticking to this thing that I've just announced and not U-turning, it's sort of presented as unusual. It's just like, wow, there's some real steel here. She hasn't just completely caved in.
But I mean, it sort of is, isn't that? Like, that started under Blair, didn't it? The whole idea, what was it? If the same story splashes the papers, I can remember it was like 3 or 4 days in a row. We probably have to reconsider what we're doing. And to different extents, I think different governments also ended up kind of behaving in a similar way. So I think you probably have to go back quite a lot to find someone who'd held their nerve. But then interestingly, I think when Boris came in, especially Cummings was there was that big idea of going, oh, we've decided we're not going to care about the Westminster bubble. We're not going to care about the press. We're just going to do what we want to do. And famously, that didn't go so well. So I think, we returned to government by grid quite quickly after that. So I think it's partly the problem as well and I'm not sure that's the lesson you should have learned, like people should have learned from Boris and Dominic Cummings.
Yeah.
But that's the one.
I mean, I think it is good to sort of just go, to sort of stick to your big plan. But there are reasonable tweaks that people have pointed out, like with farmers' inheritance tax, changing thresholds, listening to complaints and going, well, actually, we don't really want to target these people. All the things that Ros pointed out about whether you're disincentivizing certain kinds of work, or even VAT in private schools. I pointed out, without opposing the whole policy, that there are some independent schools that are scholarships for gifted musicians, and that is basically it's not generally wealthy parents. And it seems that there are certain things that you could change. You go, do you know what? We're going to listen to that. We're going to go back to tinker with it. So is she maybe too determined not to budge?
So I think I have one theory. I don't know if it explains all of it, but it explains maybe part of it. So I think part of the problem is that the press, like essentially since Keir Starmer, began looking at the next prime minister, I think, it's not just half the press, obviously. We know that the right-leaning portion, which is 2/3 at least, has been just throwing so much constant shit at Keir, at Rachel, at the shadow cabinet, then the cabinet, etc., at everyone all the time over every single possible issue because they kept trying to find an angle that will work. No, exactly, which was mad. Yeah, I think I'd just come back from the US and I was like, do I need to care about? Oh, wow, I do not need to care about that. But no, so I wonder, because technically the press should have a role in this, like should, the kind of checks and balances in a democracy of saying if a government does something, but the press goes, no, actually, hang on, this is very bad, then in an ideal world, the government would go, oh, gee, we trust the press, we probably should look at what we've done. But because the onslaught has been non-stop since day one, I wonder if that can no longer act as a compass at all. So they'll just see any attack as probably bad faith or worth ignoring, which again, very much just a theory, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, taxes are complicated, and frankly, it is hard to work out exactly what the impact of changing IHT on farmers is going to be. You can look at it in different ways, and also, you have to think about what the farmers will be able to do in order to try to avoid it, like passing down their farms before they die, for example. And because of that, it's just too complicated for a largely populist press to get their teeth into, and so they don't really know what they're proposing as an alternative, and that helps Labour.
I think that one of the fundamental reasons why this government, though, irrespective of its own sort of shortcomings in storytelling, and the fact that some of these Reeves things have just sort of popped out of nowhere, and to my mind, seem to have been executed with no great thought in advance. I mean, that was true of the cutting of the winter fuel allowance as well. If you look back at that now, you're like, what the hell was that for? Why did you get yourself into all that trouble? But the other problem is that they must be acutely aware that they only got the support of 1 in 5 of the electorate. I mean, that to me is almost this government's defining fact, right? And if you're trying to push a very big rock up a very steep hill, which is effectively what it's doing in every conceivable respect, policy-wise, there's not much of a foundation to do it. And so what's the idea? They have to sort of become hegemonic after the fact. In other words, you win an election and then you start building up a base of support. Well, it's meant to be the other way around. And it accounts for why I think that's the reason why they look nervous all the time. And they keep making unforced errors.
Well, meanwhile, Liz Kendall at the Department of Work and Pensions has launched a white paper on getting people back to work who are currently inactive due to ill health, which in G7 terms is remarkably high in the UK. The Daily Mail, of course, calls it a war on benefits Britain. And some disability and poverty campaigners would agree. But Liz Kendall, I heard her being interviewed the other day, insists that it's about help rather than punishment. John, has she pitched this right?
I think your introduction spoke volumes, right? Because it seems that there's a different version of what she's doing depending on which newspaper website you go on at any given time. And that's the way it always is with policies to do with so-called welfare, benefits, social security. So, Labour government, if you go back to Tony Blair, once they discovered this mantra of benefit conditionality, which is sanctions, the idea that if you don't do X, Y, and Z, then we're going to starve you into submission. I mean, that's actually what it means in reality, but that's always there when any Labour government in particular suggests changing the benefit system. So that's, as you said, in the sort of Daily Mail account of it. Young people who refuse to take a job will get their benefits cut. But then if you read my newspaper, if you read The Guardian, it's more like, this is a change, the benefit system isn't going to be as punitive, and the job centres are going to be reinvented, and we're going to have joined up public services, and the administration of the intersection between health and employment policy is going to be taken care of by mayors, which is a really good idea to devolve it, So actually, and it's quite hard to, when I see the Daily Mail saying, we're going to take everyone's benefits away, me coming on this podcast and saying a lot of this looks really good makes me feel really awkward, like, oh God, what have I walked into?
Kendall did
But I think there is a lot of truth.
Yeah, that it's not. She says, there's a small number of people who are like sort of taking the piss, but that's not really what this is about.
What I'm more interested in is a big sort of political sociology question underlying this, which is why is it that we're an outlier in the G7, and why is it that there are all these people who have left the labour force, and why is it that we've got so many young people who aren't working? I mean, and I haven't read anything yet that's even got near whatever the nub of that is.
I tried to write a column on that, and then I was like, wow, I actually have no idea either. Why did I decide to pitch this?
Seems
Well,
like
Fraser Nelson from The Spectator has made a documentary about it. I didn't have him down as a maker of documentaries about life at the sharp end, but he's done it. It's on Channel 4. So people are sort of trying to do the work.
But it seemed to me like, even the way she was talking about it, that it was a sort of omni problem, that it's not really about benefits. It's about the NHS, it's about housing, it's about regional inequality, it's about all of the different reasons why people are, having these sort of health problems. Yeah. So it seems like, a white paper is not going to cover that. It almost seems like the everything problem.
Yeah, but government, how often do governments, particularly a government that's got its hands as full as this one, really want to drill into all that really difficult stuff that you've just alluded to? I think one good thing about this, right, is to do with job centres, which sometimes feels like I've spent about 10 or 15% of my journalistic life talking to people who've ended up on the wrong end of their local job centre. That job centres are like this weird alien presence dropped on local shopping centres very often. It's almost like a sort of colonial outpost, the ultimate colonial outpost of Whitehall somehow, right? And everybody knows that if you go in there, bad things happen to you. Your benefits get cut, or you have to do what's called structured job searches. Have you ever seen one of those close up? I mean, that's when they effectively lock you in a room and say you've got 8 hours to unendingly search for jobs, I once saw this thing, the Work Programme, which was an innovation of the last government for people who were long-term unemployed. And it was this room in Warrington full of self-help books, people who are structurally unemployed, because this was not long after the crash, right? And they had all these books called, I remember The Problem Is You and so on, And we talked to these people who hadn't had a job for a year, and they'd say, I'm just not trying hard enough. That's what they've taught me here. And I'd say, what did you do yesterday? And they said, I wrote 30 application letters for jobs. And have you done that before? Yeah, I did it 6 months ago. Did you get any replies? No. It was just horrible, So if you burrow under the Daily Mail narrative into some of what Kendall's saying, it looks like they are trying to move away from that, right? Albeit gingerly. And that's nothing but a good thing.
Ros, the usual suspects, possibly including the Daily Mail, have blamed young snowflakes and their made-up mental health conditions. But what is actually driving these numbers?
Yeah, I mean, this is getting back to we talked about the nub. I mean, it is really hard to know, but it's undoubted that there are many more people making claims for mental health disabilities. And some of those, the biggest increase in percentage terms has been among young people. However, in absolute terms, the biggest increase in the number of claimants has been in older people because they, already tend to have more. So there has been a surge in these problems among young people, and it's really important to find out why and what's driving that. But it is everybody, and that they're slightly more likely to be women too.
The stat that blew my mind was 40% of people off work with long-term illness have 5 or more health conditions.
Yeah.
And so it was your typical person is not the young person with a mental health issue. It's a sort of middle-aged person with a bad back and on and on and on.
Yeah, it's the people you see of a morning queuing up at the pharmacist, which is a sight you see in most English or British towns. The other thing which I think is very telling in the midst of all this is it appears actually that making the benefit system, and I'm talking about benefits for people who are like job seekers allowance, benefits for people who are theoretically unemployed, that system became or has become so punitive and horrible that it drives people out of it precisely into these long-term sickness benefits. So in other words, if you make the benefit system punitive, you actually end up with even more people on benefits because they then, and this goes back to Thatcher, they then are either encouraged to or choose themselves to take refuge in sickness benefits because it's the one way of making this horrible punitive system leave you alone.
Yeah, exactly. And it's true as well that the most new disability claimants have been already out of work for more than 2 years.
There you go.
And so it speaks to this that, being out of work and not having enough money makes you ill. And we need to recognise
but it's
that.
more push than pull. What I found really interesting was that most European countries have more generous disability benefits, and they don't have this same thing of people choosing to apply for those rather than unemployment benefits.
But they also have more generous unemployment benefits.
Yeah,
That's
so it's the fact that people are being pushed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the other thing is that the new claims are concentrated in areas which are already have big problems. It's not richer southeast problems. It's places like Blackpool and especially Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales where the claims have really rocketed, where there was already a big problem and now it's getting worse.
Maria, I think 2 of 5 PIP claims are from people in work. Is there any? I mean, Kendall's talked about obviously cutting the benefits bill, but there's all this long-term stuff about how long does it take to get people sort of healthier and all that. Is there any short-term way to cut that bill that isn't going to force more people into poverty? Like, I don't see where the fat is there.
I came up with it, and for £1 million, I will tell Keir Starmer what it is. But no, seriously, no, I have no idea either. I think it's just...
I was going to go on, Marie, go on.
For 1 million, just for one house in Zone 2 London, I will tell you what the secret is. I figured it out. No, but I think I'm just going to slightly repeat what everyone else has said, but I think the problems are so interconnected. Like, sure, you could technically cut the benefits bill, but that would probably be because you would be spending so much more money on housing, on the NHS, on everything. So it's not, and none of those are short term either. So short term, and that would not cost a shit ton of money elsewhere. I have no idea because again, and it always reminds me of that really good piece published with the FT like a few years ago now on shit life syndrome. I think it was based on Blackpool and essentially kind of trying to look at why Blackpool had become so bleak for the people who lived there.
Sarah O'Connor wrote all those pieces.
Yes.
Just to give her a credit, they were brilliant. Yeah.
And the idea was, again, it was not a singular problem. Like everyone just sort of had every single problem at the same time. And so how do you fix that? How do you make that place richer? How do you make people feel better, etc.? It's just really hard because it's a bit like being confronted with one of those Gordian knots of headphones, and you're like, I don't even know what end to start pulling on. Or did I use Gordian right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I doubted myself halfway through that sentence.
Good classical illusion.
Yeah.
Very Boris Johnson.
So yeah, and then I think that's why government have to go. Oh, Jesus Christ, Dorian. It's been so fun, I must go. And I think, that's why no government has quite managed to, figure out what thread
There is
to pull
one
on.
thing you can do, which lies outside the auspices of these proposals, and which actually Rachel Reeves has arguably made more difficult by increasing employers' national insurance. You have to make work less shit. I mean, a lot of the reason why people do not like the idea of being what politicians would consider active participants in society is because it involves killing yourself for not much more than 10 quid an hour in the most awful conditions, being timed when you go to the toilet, probably in a place where there's very little public transport. So, I've met lots of people who have to get on a push bike and have an hour ride into an Amazon warehouse in the East Midlands somewhere, at 5 a.m. to work an 8-hour shift and then ride back, and I don't think you're going to even begin to crack these structural problems until you've got to grips with that. And in fairness, actually, in a limited sense, the government has done something there, because the budget, let's not forget, in the speech she gave, Rachel Reeves announced she was putting up the minimum wage quite considerably, actually, in the case of younger people. So, there's a little bit of work there.
So finally then, I mean, this thing has convinced me that I'm glad I'm not the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
I think you'd be good.
As long as I've got Marie's secret plan to unveil.
You've got
£1 million.
£1 million.
Now for a question from one of our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us on Patreon, you can submit a question to the panel. This week's comes from Alice Murray. Do you think it possible that as we watch and possibly suffer from the shit show Trump creates over the next 4 years, that it might at least damage his UK cheerleaders, Farage et al., especially if they continue to pop up to say it's all fine, and so hopefully keep them from gaining ground here? There's a lot going on there. Wow. Roz?
Yeah, I think there could potentially be quite a big backlash against the US, depending on whether Trump imposes the tariffs that he's talked about. If he does, and it leads to job losses in sectors that export a lot to the US, that could go down very, very badly. And I think then Farage and his ilk will then want to distance themselves from Trump, which, plenty of people in mainland Europe have already done. There are not all the populist right in Europe is totally sold on Trump, unlike Orban. The AfD in Germany is much more wary, not least because of the potential impact on Germany's car industry. So I think for a while, there will be some excitement if there is very performative, deportation of immigrants, and Trump appears to be in the short term cracking down, as he would say, on immigration. And there will be plenty of people here who are very happy to point and say, well, why can't we do that? It's time to push the boats back and make that kind of argument. But in the longer term, I don't think the association is going to do Farage nearly as much good as he imagines. Although, none of us ever have been quite sure where the populist right in this country does get its money from, and undoubtedly there will be mechanisms by which he benefits financially.
John, how much knock-on effect is there? Because I remember thinking when Trump lost, Bolsonaro lost, and I thought, populism is, the wave is all going out. Whatever. And yet you continue to see sort of victories in different countries perhaps you haven't been paying attention to, like Slovakia.
Yeah.
So, I mean, does the failure of one populist, damage others? Does the success of... Because people also talk about, Trump's win will embolden the far right in Britain.
No, I don't. I'm going to argue against Ross slightly here, I think, in as much as... I think sometimes Farage's association with Trump and the idea that he's not representing the people of Clacton and he's jetting off yet again is maybe a little bit inconvenient for him. But I think the drivers of Farage's popularity and the fact that he has been such a huge political figure for as long as he has are 95% domestic. British people want it both ways. If you look in polls, most of them don't like Trump, even sort of Farage Brexit type people. And I think they just kind of write that off. It happened to me a bit on the Farmers' March because Farage didn't speak, but he was around and Clarkson was there. But it keeps happening to me all the time in other sort of settings. I think reform is really, really on the up. It feels to me in a way that I can't quite explain that the current Conservative Party is an irrelevance. It might be a sort of straw in the wind in as much as people like Jenrick and Badenoch to some extent lean in a right-wing populism, which shows you that they think it's the way to go. But I think that sort of loose coalition of forces, so to speak, around Farage, I think it's really, really insurgent at the moment. And I think there's a whole set of conversations about Labour's political backyard, South Welsh valleys, northeast of England, East Midlands. Reform's starting to do quite well in Scotland, right? Which I never thought I'd see. So I think something really ugly is really brewing in this country. It's not like we haven't seen it already in the form of Brexit, but I think this time it means business, and it's really, really means business, and it's got its eyes on power. And so if Trump screws up, and it seems to me that on tariffs alone, Trump could find himself in very deep water. I think British politics is still sort of parochial enough that won't harm Farage. I think Farage really has momentum at the moment. I'm not saying that in any gleeful way. I find it terrifying, but I think that's true.
Do you think, Trump's fortunes could affect the reputation of people like beloved national treasure Liz Truss?
Could affect Liz Truss's reputation, did you say?
The beloved national treasure, yeah.
I was as a national treasure. Right, okay, fair enough then. When you say national treasure.
No, I think I'm going to agree with Ros entirely. It depends entirely on the effect it has on Britain. I'm not convinced they're going to go, oh, well, look at what they did in, the States. I couldn't, like anyone who associates themselves with him, But I do think that if in some way, like in some easily explainable ways, the US makes the UK feel worse for people, then obviously that would not work. I think the problem as well with the Tories at the moment is that they have no idea what they stand for. And, and was Reform sort of does. And obviously I think their message isn't actually coherent. Like they wouldn't know what to do with power, but at least they sound like they know what they want. Whereas I think the Tories do not sound like they know what they want. And actually Labour in some ways, they do, but they don't. And again, for all the reasons outlined earlier, that they're still a bit occasionally like amorphous. And I think, the problem is that then if you do have one party that kind of feels like it knows really what it stands for, then they're going to do quite well. Maybe the Lib Dems. We need the Lib Dems to really let Ed Davey save us in our hour of need.
Next up, the BBC's documentary about 1990s lads mag Loaded, called Lads, Mags and Mayhem, suggests that a few hedonistic journalists 30 years ago paved the way for the toxic manosphere epitomised by Andrew Tate. Is it fair to blame Loaded for unintended consequences, and what can we learn from what it became? Marie, we've all watched the documentary. What did you make of it? Its message as such, which is comes very late, I think, in the show.
It does. It's a weird one. Because I was a kid in the 90s, so I feel like I didn't. So I would say the kind of Loaded culture, which to an extent I think we sort of had in France as well. We had the lads bags and stuff as well. Was kind of the backdrop to my childhood as opposed to stuff I actively knew was happening. So it was quite interesting to be like, oh, okay, so that's presumably what it felt like, etc. And the problem is it feels slightly exciting, I think, and the documentary does it quite well. I think of portraying it at the beginning as genuinely thrilling. It's a new thing and it's fun, and everyone there's a line actually I think quite near the end, and one of the main guys is like, you know what, we were just very alive back then, which I really enjoyed, and I think you get that sense. But also, I don't know. Because the theory at the end is that everything that's bad about the relationship between like men and women, the way men treat women, comes from Loaded, which is true. I feel like there was a feminist paradise, I think, in the early 90s. But again, as someone from that slightly later generation, it does put stuff into context, and I don't actually entirely hate the idea that they were the precursor to something in that. So because my equivalent, I guess, to Loaded was Vice magazine in the kind of like mid 2000s, and what Vice did was exactly the same. It was kind of nudge nudge wink wink, like we're going to make quite a lot of like racist jokes, sexist jokes, talk about sex a lot in a way that's a bit gross and stuff, but also it's kind of fine because we know we're not being entirely serious. We know we're not actually sexist. We're not. And I think, people at school in LA, we read that, we talked about it. We were, despite being feminist and anti-racist and stuff, like that's the stuff we enjoyed because we thought we were being, again, sort of like cynical. And a bit like, but that's a direct, like you can draw a nearly direct line.
There's education in the limits of irony, I think.
But no, because Loaded, they said that as well, as saying, it's about men being laddish, but sort of being aware of the fact that they would be like acting laddishly. And I think Vice was probably the same of going, we're being very edgy, but we're sort of aware that we're doing it on purpose, so it's less bad. So in that respect, I can definitely see that there's definitely A and B, then whether C does see as Andrew Tate is, I think, a different question. But
Yeah, it's weird seeing Jordan Peterson, not a loaded character, crop up at the end. Ros, I remember seeing the first issue in May '94. It had Gary Oldman smoking a fag on the cover and the strap line, "For men who should know better." I think people might be surprised to see this, that it was almost always sort of geezers on the cover.
It was then.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. In that period, what did you do? You remember that? Do you remember it arriving? What did you make of it as a sort of cultural?
To be honest,
weather vane?
no, I wasn't in that space. I mean, I was at university and I was on campus in Norwich, and
I'm sure they had loaded in Norwich.
I'm sure they had loaded in Norwich, but I wasn't, analysing the media. I remember, I indulged in a lot of slightly snobbish feminism at the time, and I remember thinking, and part of my brain was thinking, oh, it's good to see that men can consume magazines that are just as shit as the stuff they give us as well. But it didn't really go much further than that. I mean, you've got to remember 1994, so I'd been 19 about the time, and so I guess I came of age into that, and I hadn't really known anything different because I did not grow up in a large city. I lived a fairly sheltered life until I went to university, and arguably at university for a while. So it didn't really penetrate my consciousness.
were you not a ladette?
No, I was not. No, I wanted desperately to be taken seriously
Ladettes
by
didn't
men.
exist then; they were invented later.
Yeah, I wanted desperately to be taken seriously by men and listened to for my ideas, and I didn't see that kind of in loaded, so I just didn't go.
I thought it quite
near
interesting that basically the idea, of course, that there was sort of somewhat a reaction against political correctness, not in a kind of viciously sort of what we would now identify as the anti-woke way, but a kind of like, oh, for God's sake, let's just relax. And yet, of course, a lot of the people in it reading it, a lot of people in the country, i.e. outside like the London magazine world, were not particularly bound by political correctness before. So it wasn't as if the whole country, it was like the whole, the story of punk, where it's like everybody was listening to disco and then punk happened. And it was like, well, they weren't, it was just sort of, a lot of people just sort of doing their own thing.
Yeah.
John, Loaded was launched by your enemy colleague, right, James Brown?
Yeah, I never...
Did you not overlap?
No, we did. I don't think we overlapped. James was around, and I'd left university by then, and I was working at the NME in '94. I mean, that was my sort of my most joyous time at the NME because Britpop had just started. And Loaded, I worked in King's Reach Tower, which is this huge brown obelisk on the South Bank, and Loaded were in a low-rise bit right next door. So we sort of knew what they were doing, and we talked to them, and we were very, very aware of it.
Well, their main thing initially, and I don't think this is bullshit because I do remember reading those early ones, is that there would be the starting with Elizabeth Hurley, the woman in her scanties in there. But like a lot of it was sort of The Italian Job and With Nail and I and football.
Greasy Spoon cafes.
And, there was this whole kind of like, collection of kind of, sort of icons, and they had their certain, bands and movies and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think it was politically reactionary, unconsciously, if not consciously? James Brown would obviously sort of deny that. Like, how much can you read into that idea initially of just allowing men to be just sort of silly?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. See, of course, the documentary has to fixate on Loaded magazine, and it's a great story, right? Mm-hmm. But the idea that was wholly or largely responsible for this kind of set of cultural changes is obviously misplaced. I mean, that's like the great men's school of history, right?
Well, it's like
I don't buy it, and I'm not sure. And I'm not sure
Brexit.
they buy it either, right? The people who were working there. I think what happened, right, and which you can characterise as a sort of backlash, and as you say, not necessarily out there, but in sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, like, what do they call them? Opinion forming circles, like media people and
the chatterati.
Politicians and people in rock groups and all of that, right? The people who, for better or worse, make the cultural weather. It was a backlash against the 80s. And actually, that backlash was underway 5 or 6 years before Loaded started. Acid House is what did that, right? My theory about why things changed in the 90s in the way that they did is all to do with Acid House. And it so happened that a lot of us had this quite sort of introverted, censorious, don't take drugs, don't get drunk, experience of the 80s, some of which was really good, right? So the fact that you had to, if you like the Smiths, somehow you had to read The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir and all that. It was a good thing, it made us better people in all sorts of ways. But then the Berlin Wall came down and along came this thing that just said, just have a pill, right? Listen to this dance music and just let it all go. Just be who you want to be. We're not here to judge anybody. Hedonism rules, right? And very definitely, and I think James Brown would say this himself, Loaded grew out of that, right? So it was sort of in train anyway, and Loaded expressed men's side of that very, very skillfully and very wittily and very, very and very cleverly at first, right? That isn't to say, as Miranda Sawyer says in the documentary, that there weren't parts of it that by any modern standard were deeply problematic. And that, I can recall among people I work with sometimes, an issue at Loaded would come in and go, wow, are they doing that now? Like Joe Guest is in it without a top on and all that,
Well, this was the thing. Women kind of adapted themselves to that kind of thing. And I do remember that happening as time went on, and Loaded and all the rest, and FHM, they all became more that there were more women ostensibly enjoying themselves, getting their tits out for the lads in the magazines. And I think almost there was a strand of feminist thinking that started to adapt itself to that as well. And you saw it a little bit in, say, Natasha Walter, New Feminism, 1998, when she argued, which she's since completely changed her mind on, but she argued that feminism was, the personal was not political. And you could go out there and you could dress how you liked and talk how you liked and have as much sex as you liked. And that made no difference and should have no impact on the political campaigning, that aspect of feminism. And that kind of, I think, as it was suggested in the documentary, it was really quite freeing for quite a lot of women who did want to go out and have a good time and get pissed with the lads, because it was, it could be really fun. It was nice being treated in some ways, as an equal and being invited into that, even though it turned so horrible and sour.
Well, I mean, my theory of the 90s and possibly culture in general is just that there's always this explosive moment when it's just like, oh, we didn't think we could do that, but now we can do that. And there's so much this fun and liberation. And it's, oh, this is amazing. And then the novelty wears off, and then it all goes wrong.
Well, you
and
get
everyone's
hangover. You get hangover.
Yeah, it's the hangover. Yeah. And everyone's just like, oh no, what have we done? And it becomes sort of quite grotesque. And I suppose this really pushes that narrative, because you've got like this bit in the sort of the 1996 Loaded tour.
That was it.
So
that's the hinge. That's the hinge.
And you look
right?
at this crowd, they're all chanting Martin Deason's name, like decent, and it's like it's a Shitler youth rally. They're just everybody. It's just like, and they're looking out and they're just going, this is awful.
Oh yeah, totally. But and all of that baggage that somehow allowed them to say, well, this isn't just Joe Guest with a top off, right? There is a sort of general cultural worldview here, which we deserve credit for, which is to do with Hunter S. Thompson and, as you say, Michael Caine and Paul Weller and Mods and the Clash and all sorts of things. So none of those people on the Loaded tour turn up to those nightclubs to ogle Kathy Lloyd and Joe Guest and
tell us about James Ellroy.
No, exactly. Like have you read Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas? The bit with the Samoan attorney. Do you like that? Right? No, forget it. And that's the point at which it's like the inverted commas on either side of the stage. It's like Theresa May's speech. They just go boom like that and fall to the ground. And suddenly they're exposed, aren't they? It's like, oh wow, the irony's gone.
But I would argue that one of the main turning points as well, watching the documentary, and I can't remember who said it.
It is a brilliant documentary.
It really is. But one of the female interviewees said that things started going sour when they would essentially ask women who had quote unquote real jobs, so like journalists, TV presenters, whatever, to be in the magazine, but they would only be in the magazine in their underwear. And I think, she identified that as a moment of saying, okay, kind of went from going, oh, well, every lad likes, looking at tits sometimes, to being like, no, if you're a woman, if you want to be in the magazine, because you have an interesting job, career, things to say, you have an album out, you'll still need to get your tits out. And I would argue that that's actually a weirdly quite big hinge as well.
Then it gets super dark when FHM really takes off. It'd been around for quite a while, but it really takes off. And then Loaded becomes, after James Brown leaves, becomes more and more just like tits ahoy.
Yeah.
And then it gets into Nuts and Zoo, and you're just kind of like this sort of toxic degradation. And this is the era. So people talk about, the 90s. It really sort of gets super grimy by the noughties. And you've got GB News arsehole and former Brexit Party MEP Martin Daubney edited Loaded for 7 years.
Mince your words, Dorian, about Mark Daubney. Come on. Be honest. What do you really think?
Sue me, Daubney. He organised a straight pride march.
He did.
Yeah. And then in America, you had Greg Gutfield, used to edit Men's Health and Maxim, who's now Fox News host. I mean, if you're trying to make this argument, Marie, is that pipeline damning in itself? You could literally go, the former editor of Loaded is now one of the leading voices on that wing of things.
I'm not entirely sure. So maybe, but also my other theory would be that there will always be very sexist men just in society at any given point. And I think, if anything, what's interesting is when those men get to rise in positions of power and when they disappear a bit from the mainstream and when they come back in. So it's a sort of like a weird index of like, are the sexists getting really good jobs again or like getting really highly paid again? Ooh, we're getting to a point of history that's not great for women. So yeah, well, and again, I have no idea which is which, but I think it's probably one of those two or maybe both.
I like the fact that one of the editors became a potter.
He was
he
was the guy who invented, I don't know which one, but he invented Zoo on Nuts. Derek Harbison you're talking about.
Yeah. So his track record was not great, but now he just seems to be quite happy making pots in the countryside, which is better than being a MEP for the Brexit Party.
There was nothing, there was nothing political about Loaded though, and I don't think there was anything really political about all its successors and FHM and so on. It was almost devoid of politics, partly because it came along at a time when there was not much acute political debate, and the Tories were on their way out. That was clear, and the fact that it became associated with Cool Britannia, and because Blair invited the Gallaghers into Downing Street and whatever, made people think that there was some kind of big political element to this, but there wasn't.
Oh, I think there was a strong political with a small p element. I don't think that you're necessarily arguing against that. You mean in terms of sort of conscious, programmatic politics?
Yeah, because we're talking about whether it informed Daubney.
Is there a book about politics and culture in this period, John?
There is, actually. Still in print, Dorian.
Oh, God, you've written it. Yeah.
I wrote that book in 2001 and 2002, so the dust hadn't settled.
Yeah, that was ambitious. Just be like, well, that's done.
Yeah, well, we were all in a hurry in those days for various reasons. So I did write a history of it. What do you want me to talk about specifically, briefly? I suppose what I'm struck by, to answer this question about whether it's political, was that clearly, in the midst of it, it just felt like, wow, we've really left the 80s behind here. And we've left some aspects of the 80s behind that probably did need leaving behind. But, like the Margaret Thatcher and the miners' strike and God knows what.
And football hooliganism.
And football hooliganism, right? And, it's a nicer country to live in all sorts of respects. But there's some of it perhaps we should have retained, right? Which were kind of don't be a sexist arsehole and all, and those things, which came with the music that you listened to and the books you read and the films that you watched. Now, that then leads you on to another question. Has something like that been restored? So in other words, was there a backlash against the backlash eventually? And I think there probably was,
Yeah.
When that Loaded documentary I happened to watch, and my 15-year-old daughter came in the room, and by that point it had moved on to the Zoo and Nuts period, and she was sort of scandalised, like, wow, you could buy this in W.H. Smith's, And, wow, people actually liked that and thought it was acceptable, because she's of a generation where, for want of a better word, some element of wokeness is sort of built into their culture, right? And they remind me actually more of my generation when we were 15, 16, reading Simone de Beauvoir and all that,
Well, I noticed that my daughter, who's 18, and that she's very interested in the 90s, and it's all nostalgia. It's a filter, right? And so it focuses on the sort of nice bits. And so she's sort of interested in sort of, the music and the kind of the Kate Moss of it all. But it's all the kind of the lightness. And there are other people I've seen write about this, kind of Gen Z people, where they kind of love that idea of, because things are quite heavy now, generally, and not because of woke, just because of everything. And they're kind of for the lightness and the optimism and the hedonism, and they basically leave out the other side, the cocaine come down, the be here now, the kind of it. They're looking at. They're looking at this kind of idealised release of the 90s. Maria, I did wonder when it ends with, it has Andrew Tate and it has Jordan Peterson, whatever. Now, I think both of those you could say are kind of like sort of preachers of a rather aggressive form of masculinity. But I mean, I didn't see them as sort of lads in the loaded sense. That it seemed much more sort of.
Imagine popping a pill with Jordan Peterson. Just fucking hell.
I thought.
You wouldn't
I
go.
kind of want to do it now, but yeah.
You wouldn't go on a caper with him, would you? And it would, to Ibiza, and it's a much darker. It is a much darker energy, and that was where I just wondered whether the whole thing of just going, well, this is sort of a version of masculinity, and this 30 years later is a version of masculinity, and there's a sort of connection, and it's like, well, but they're really quite different. That initially loaded humour was such a huge part of it. Does anybody tune in to Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson for the laughs? I don't think they do.
I tune in to laugh at Jordan Peterson.
It's all
That's
about
a different
self-improvement, isn't it? I mean,
But as I say, it's not fun, I think.
It wasn't about self-improvement at all. It was like destroy yourself.
Exactly.
No, it should have been the strapline.
Because even I feel like what we were talking about earlier, the fact that I do think there's an A to B of like loaded to Vice, and Vice was really fun as well, and it was about people like young people dressing in very silly ways and drinking too much and doing drugs, etc. But now I feel like that's not. Yeah, well, we're in actually quite a humorless era anyway, and I think and sort of you see that with the your Jordan Petersons and your Andrew Tates, etc. But I can't really think of anything that's, I guess, catered to younger men and is just quite jolly as well. And again, even if it's politically incorrect or stuff that I would personally find very distasteful because I'm in my 30s and a woman, but I can't think of anything that's like fun. And,
that's what I find weird, I suppose, to wrap up, like the backlash against the alleged sort of humorlessness of woke, to use that word, is also humorless. There isn't a kind of like... fun. I mean, I know some people find Trump fun, I guess, but I mean, I don't generally
no one's
find...
having a great time, you get
No,
the sense,
nobody's having fun. That's especially on this podcast. It's the end of the show. So what are the stories that have gone under the radar this week? Roz? What? Let's try that again in a normal voice. I feel I'm really scared of you.
I know you are, Doreen. You just hide it so well.
Roz, kick us off.
Well, it's a bit, inside baseball, but it's good that the Justice Secretary is going to give more money, it's rumoured, for legal aid for asylum seekers, basically, because it's the only way to tackle the backlog and get people out of the accommodation, the temporary accommodation they're in, and hotels and so on. And of course, the right will hate it because it's giving money to legal aid lawyers. But you've got to deal with these cases, and you've got to deal with them fairly. And I'm glad that they're actually confronting that issue. It speaks to a seriousness and speaks to good values.
Yeah, no, it's a thing. It's a pattern really of Labour doing quite a lot of good things that are not kind of creating a narrative of good things.
Yeah.
John.
So you talked about me reporting on the Farmers' March the other week, and so I was on the train back to the West Country where I live, where there's quite a few farmers, including me, and there was four people who'd been on the Farmers' March who were on the seats at the table next to me. I didn't have a seat at the table. Anyway, and the Great Western Railway ticket guy came round and he said, "You got the wrong tickets." So already these people had been irate, presumably, about Keir Starmer and the awfulness of this government and all that, and the general rottenness of Britain. And then the GWR guy appeared and went, "Let me see your tickets." And he went, "Oh, you've got the wrong tickets." And he goes, "And that's going to be an extra £30 each." It's like a dream sort of Farage East experience, isn't it? In terms of sort of, all points rebellion against everything. So he busted them. And then I thought, oh, God, are you going to bust me? So, because we'd all come home slightly earlier from the farmers' protest than we thought we were going to. And I got fined 30 quid as well, right? And this is a common experience. And when it happens to you, it feels like a form of extortion. You're just on the train home and suddenly just someone... And I said to the guy, Trainline just coughed me this ticket out. I didn't know what I was buying. It just said, "Here's your ticket back to Westbury." Oh, right, it's £30 for you as well. Anyway, I then... this morning, read a comment piece by John Elledge of This Parish about the insane complexity of the British railway system still, even though the current Transport Secretary Lou Hay has said that, has used the word labyrinthine about it and said she's going to do something about it. Anyway, there is a huge story about Northern Rail, which is the train operator in and around Manchester, and how it's treating people who, on the most specious of excuses, it's busting for having the wrong ticket or a rail card, which is a matter of weeks out of date. And there is a person on X, he's still on X, this person doesn't appear to have gone to Blue Sky yet like the rest of us, but anyway, called Jack Fifield, who makes a point of chronicling this. And it's unbelievable. A 43-year-old woman who travelled a 7-minute journey from Levenshulme to Manchester Piccadilly, paying £2.44 rather than £3.70 as she added a 16 to 25 rail card to her ticket. Northern Rail want £150 out of her. This goes through the courts, plus £3.70 fare. Other people get done for like 450, 500 quid, for the fact that they forgot, their rail cards 2 days out of date, or it's an off-peak ticket. It's
you travel
in a peak time or whatever it is, right? Yeah. And you get a criminal record. And if you read this stuff, it's like reading 1,000 little post office scandals that have happened on this awful private train operator. And I suppose because it's happening in the northwest of England, can you imagine if this was happening on the overground here? There would be hell to pay, wouldn't there? It would make it very prominently into the national media. I don't think this story's made it nearly enough into the national media.
I see people fare dodging on the overground, which I take fairly regularly, every day, all the time, and no one stops them because they're young men and their ticket collectors aren't going to get involved, are they? Because you don't want to, and that's the really infuriating thing. They go for the targets who will actually pay up.
Yeah, totally.
Can we crack open the word Kafkaesque for this one?
Well, is it Kafkaesque? Because they tell you what you're accused of. Doesn't that make it not Kafkaesque?
No, back in the box with Kafkaesque.
Like a good Faragist farmer, I know my Kafka. But look at some of these are unbelievable. A 23-year-old from Manchester travelled from Liverpool to Manchester using a rail card which expired 1 month prior. Ticket cost £14.30. He was forced to pay through the courts £472.30. Right? So if you're still on X, if you haven't deleted it from your phone, I would have a look at this guy, Jack Fifield, and I think there's a huge, huge story here, particularly if it's ongoing, which it clearly is.
Marie, what's under the radar?
France, my country, Dorian, is very sick.
Please, I need medicine for my country.
No, what I think, I think that obviously the kind of chaos of French politics made the headlines abroad a fair bit over the summer. But then, Barnier was appointed as Prime Minister. And then I feel like we've not heard a lot since, at least from the British press. And it is not going well at all. Like, amazing having an entirely split sort of like National Assembly and also Prime Minister who doesn't actually represent a single of the main factions. You'll be shocked to hear is not working out great. But no, so Barnier has been working on a budget because obviously countries need budgets. It's not, that's also not going well at all because no one can agree on what to put and, what they would vote down, what they would vote for, etc. So as things stand, the rumour is at the moment that there will be a vote of no confidence against Barnier, which would mean that his government would fall. There's also quite a fun meta little press story where Le Parisien, like the newspaper, did a story on how Macron believes that Barnier is about to lose a vote of no confidence, essentially, and the government will fall. But then the Élysée Palace has said in no uncertain terms, they were like, no, never said that, absolutely not. But Le Parisien is sticking to their story, so that there's a bit of a hoo-ha at the moment. And but also whatever happens, even if he doesn't fall and somehow there's a budget that gets through, what's become very clear over the past months is that the real kingmaker in the Assembly are the National Front, or the Rassemblement National as we call them now. And isn't that great? Isn't that so it's not going so good.
I was in Paris the other day and I went to the Louvre for the first time. Strongly recommended. And I was looking out the window and looking at the French flag fluttering over the massive courtyard there, and I was thinking, God, I'd feel really differently about this if it was Le Pen's country. Like I felt quite kind of, even that feeling of just how you feel, how you react to countries. Like I'm quite anti-American at the moment. Like it does matter. So that's depressing.
Yeah.
Also depressing. In Romania, when I was doing the origin story fascism book, I ended up writing the bit about kind of sort of failed fascists between the wars. And one of them was an absolute lunatic Romanian called Corneliu Codreanu, who led the Iron Guard and was a kind of...
Were they social democrats?
A sort of religious fanatic. It ended very badly for him. Anyway, he has been called a national hero by Călin Georgescu, a pro-Russian, anti-NATO, ultra-nationalist who has just come first in the first round of the Romanian elections. With 22%, centre-left pro-EU Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu resigned after coming third. There's going to be a runoff on the 8th of December. One hopes that you will have that runoff thing that we see in France, where there's a kind of like, let's all stop the fascists, because he's still only got 22%. But who knows? Apparently it's mostly a sort of protest vote about cost of living, which we have seen before, so it's that. But also it's been blamed on TikTok, where he's very big on TikTok, and the Romanian government has ordered the CEO of TikTok to answer for this. I don't know if that's a
Good luck to them.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if they're going to sort of turn up. But yes, sort of the collision of 1930s Christo-fascism and TikTok, which seems just very now. No wonder people like the 90s so much. It's just a bit of fun. And that's the show. Thank you to Marie,
Thank you.
Roz,
Thank you.
and our guest John Harris.
Thank you.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop and a roll call of the Patreon supporters who keep the podcast going. You can join them for just £3 a month. Get the podcast early without ads and lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon.
Hello, and massive thanks from me for supporting us to Maggie Rankin, Tasha Ray, and Richard Maunder.
Big shout of appreciation from me to Frances Kings, Liz Allen and Moyd.
Hello to brand new backer Jenny Sutherland and a welcome back to Chris Wimlett and Daniel Roberts. We'll see you next time.